Thank you and welcome everyone to this session entitled Macro Productivity for the 2022 CSAE conference. My name is Dadam. I'm an associate, a research associate at the CSAE and a faculty member at Oxford. And it's my pleasure to chair this session. We've got four excellent papers that are going to be presented shortly. Let me just very quickly run through the ground rules today. This is important for presenters and also those who want to ask questions. We're going to run the session 4 presentations, each of 15 minutes duration, back to back. So we're going to have the 4 presenters speak. You're welcome to submit your questions as you go. Use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. And it's important that you make reference to the paper that you want to ask the question about in case there's any confusion. So you can either use the author's first name, Vincent, Marco, Bruno, or Karol, all very straightforward names, or you can use the title of the paper. I will see the questions, and if we want your question to be presented, which I hope we will, we'll call on you. You'll be unmuted during the Q&A session, so your question will be recorded. You won't appear on the video, but you'll be able to present your questions. If you can't present your own question and you don't wish to, just say so when you're writing the question, and I can present it for you. I think that's all we need by way of preliminaries. So it's my real pleasure to kick off this session by inviting Vincent Dadam to present his paper on hysteresis in the South African labour market. So let me unshare my screen and pass the microphone to Vincent. And yeah, you've got 15 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Christopher, for the introduction. I will be now sharing my screen. Okay, 1 sec. Okay, all good, right? Let me just start from the top, sorry. Okay. All right, so my name is Vincent and I'm based here in South Africa, and this is something that we've been working on for a while now. And we're trying to investigate what could be the reason why unemployment is super persistent in the South African economy. And we are putting across the hysteresis and hypothesis. So to give you a little bit of a picture of how bad the situation here is, the unemployment really is one of the defining characteristics of the South African economy. And it's gone up from 29.1% in the first quarter in 2020, right before the effect of the lockdown, because South Africa had the hard lockdown. And then it rose to 34.4% in the second quarter of 2021. Now, if you include the discouraged, then the number goes even higher to 44.4%. And to give you a little bit of a context, right before the financial crisis, when the economy was on a sustained growth path, the level was 21.1%. And now, obviously, the youth are more particularly affected with a number of 64.4% in the second quarter of 2021. Another characteristic of unemployment is that it follows right closely growth patterns, right? And this is what is shown in the figure that you have on your screen, where we inverted the unemployment series so that you can see the co-movement between GDP growth and unemployment. Now, given these premises, what we do in this paper is basically trying to investigate what could be the drivers of this double negative trend by first providing evidence of hysteresis in the unemployment series. And that will be made clear in a second. And in the second point is that we, having proven that there is hysteresis in the unemployment series, we're trying to use a simple model with insiders and outsider dynamic just to identify what could be the causes of this high persistence in unemployment. And also we're trying to discuss what could be the implication of this finding. So for the first part, what we are doing here is basically putting the definition of hysteresis to the test of unemployment, or rather the unemployment to the test of defining hysteresis like it's been done in the literature. Now, the first paper that basically pioneered hysteresis in economics was done by Blanchard in summer, where they try to investigate increases in unemployment that was persistent in the 80s. Now, after the crisis, the idea became more prominent because of the persistent stagnation despite the fact that monetary policy was at a zero lower bound. Now, recently, there's also been more interest in the labor market on that issue. Gali, for instance, defined hysteresis as a long-lasting deviation of unemployment from what would be called a flexible wage underlying natural rate of unemployment, while Garga and Singh define it as a permanent change in the potential output, right? So basically, what comes out of this literature is that you expect that there should be a unit root in the unemployment series as an evidence for persistence and hysteresis. Now, this is the easiest part. It's been done. We did the test, and then we find evidence of unit root in the unemployment series. But that's only the simple part. Now, we're not only talking about persistence here. We also want to discuss whether there is remnants. That's a feature of hysteresis that we are more interested about. Now, what is remnants? It basically means that once you apply or you remove a shock, the system completely changes its equilibrium. And this is explained in the figure that you have on your screen at the moment. Now, on the left panel, you have a system with natural rate model. And on the other side, you have a model with hysteresis. Now, in a natural rate model, when you're in equilibrium on point A, and then there's a contractory shock, you move the economy from point A to point B. But as the shock dies out, the economy goes back to the equilibrium that is point A. However, in a system with hysteresis, it's a different story, because once you move from point A as a response to a contractory shock to point B, you don't return to that initial point, but you move to a higher point, that is A bar, okay? The same thing applies for an expansionary shock. Now, how do you model something like that? So first of all, we want to put across the idea that it's not just remnants that we are focused on. We also think about a selective memory. Is the series, does the series have a memory bank? And in that memory bank, what are the shocks that are important and the ones that are not? So basically the series picked which ones have a long-lasting effect and others that could be wiped out completely from the memory bank. Now, to achieve that, we follow a paper by Cross in 1994, who was one of the first to apply it to the labor market. And we use the Preysack model of physics that we apply to the unemployment series. Now, simply put, we're just trying to identify in the series, right, what are the dominant shocks? And from there, we calculate a nonlinear transformation by putting a certain weight to each shock, depending on its degree of remnants, of how much some of the shocks remain in the series and the effect are felt in a very long period of time. Now, once you do that, you can create an index that we test for strong hysteresis following the paper by Piscitelli and others. Now, when we do that, we come with this index, this new series, right, that we put against unemployment rate itself. So I just want to drag your attention to the transformation itself, right? So the dashed line is what we obtain after applying the Preysack model to the unemployment series. And we put it against the OECD indicators of recessions in South Africa, right? So we are quite happy about the fact that the index quite follow those recessions very well, right? So here we have the 2008 financial crisis. Now the story in South Africa is that when the unemployment went up, it reached a certain plateau and it stayed there for a long time, but only because there was strong fiscal space and then fiscal support to the economy, right? Until we reached in 2015 another period of recession in the South African economy where the unemployment pushed up again to a certain plateau and then kept going. And right here, this is when you start feeling the early effect of the COVID pandemic. Now, this is already a good thing because it captures all the recessions as captured by the OECD indexes. But some of the things are not really captured here. And I'm talking about locally, domestic shocks that we do by putting that same hysteresis index to the business confidence index in South Africa. And there we see a very good co-movement that is pretty much neat, right? Because, okay, so in the beginning of the sample, we have already the effect of the end of the apartheid regime when a lot of people managed to enter the labor market. So the business confidence started increasing, but then it took time for the unemployment to actually catch up with that, right? So as the business index goes up, the unemployment started, the index captured that increased very well. And then after the crisis, right, we have this plateau here that is also well kept, like, we get that movement. And what was missing in the other figure was just this divergence between those two indexes, right? Like, because there you can see that although there was not recessions in the country, business confidence was quite bad, and then it started decreasing. And as a response, the index captured that unemployment was going up, and then it tells a very good story. Yeah. So another test that we can do here is basically to see how the hysteresis index help basically forecast the unemployment series, right? And we do that by comparing it, by doing an out of sample forecast and comparing it with an AR1 process, right? Forecast, if you want. So the dark line is the unemployment series itself, and then this, the straight line, it's basically an AR1. You're just expecting unemployment yesterday to be the same as unemployment today. So you have a straight line. However, if you include the hysteresis index that we just created using the unemployment series to forecast out of sample unemployment, we see that there is quite a good performance of that exercise. Okay, so basically, at that point, we're quite happy that we have evidence of hysteresis in unemployment series. Now, moving on to the second part, to assess what could be the causes and consequences of this finding, right? To do that, we use a model following a framework by Blanchard and Coa that was published in 1989. And to that model, we augment it with insiders and outsiders dynamics so that we can account for hysteresis. Now, we assume imperfect competition in the product and the labor market to reflect the monopolistic nature of the environment in South Africa. And then we also make the assumption that firms produce the same goods and use the same technology and wage are uniform. This is pretty much standard in the literature. So the model is in log terms given by the following set of equations, right? So you have the production function, which is a standard cup-to-glass function. And then you have the demand for goods. Then you have the price that is set up as a markup on the unit labor cost. And then you have a labor market as unemployment and employment, but also as a function of real wages. So you have the standards, productivity shock, demand shock, and then markup shocks, and then finally labor market shocks. Now, the augmentation of the model comes from the assumption of hysteresis. Now we assume that in the labor market, you have insiders and then people who are outside of the labor market, right? So how it works is that you have a target wage, okay? And that target wage is deviates from it and become the wage tomorrow, based on wage shocks, demand shocks, and a markup shock, okay? Now, how do you define that target wage? The target wage is defined as the expected employment in the future, right? And also as the parameter lambda, which is basically the hysteresis parameter, okay? And lambda is set between 0 and 1. So the idea is that if lambda is set between 0 and 1 and less than 1, right? So the bargain wage consider an expected level of employment that will be higher than what it was in the previous period, right? Because you're implicit here and then you have a bigger sample size or bigger workforce. However, if lambda is 0, you virtually gives no weight to the unemployed or the outsiders, right? Which means that your expected employment tomorrow will be exactly the one as yesterday, keeping the unemployment quite high. And if a lot of people lost their work in the previous period, you get the picture, right? The unemployment keeps rising. Now, to solve this model, we have to make the assumption that there is full hysteresis in the economy. And to do that, we're quite happy to do that because of the finding that we did in the first part of the paper. And solving the model gives you this set of equations that we estimate using Bayesian VAR techniques. So I would like to highlight that, like, all the responses are standards in the literature and, like, they're in line with our expectation. And all we wanted to do here is just emphasizing on a couple of points. Now, what I'm going to do here is just talk about first a nominal wage shock. A nominal wage shock pretty much has no impact on output and employment because of the rigidity nature of that of the variable. However, we find that there is an increase in prices, right? that is quite high, and it remains high for a certain period of time. And as a response, unemployment also increases. Now, if you have now a markup shock has little effect on output, and also it decreases employment. But what we are quite happy about is to see that the response of employment quite increases and remain high for a certain period of time, which is one of the features of hysteresis. Now, this clearly shows that there is a strong connectivity between nominal wage prices and unemployment, right? And this is basically confirmed by the forecast error variance decomposition, in which we have first nominal wage. As I said, as the forecast horizon increases, you see that nominal wage is explained by its previous value, right? And also demand shocks. However, when you see the prices, as the horizon increases, right, prices respond more. Nominal wage shocks explain more the error in prices, right? And all that is basically dumped into the unemployment rate, where you also see that as the horizon increases, the forecast error in explaining unemployment gain in sizes. Okay, so this is quite standard in the literature, because the idea is that usually the economy is characterized by high bargaining power. So the workers can demand high wages, and because of the monopolistic nature of the product market, the firms can also increase the prices, but they can only do so because the economy is in an inflation targeting regime, right? So what the firms do in reaction to that is basically firing more people, therefore increasing the level of unemployment. Okay, so this is a strong connection that we find. And
you're in your last minute.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, because I'm also concluding that. Well, I'm not going to go through what I just said, because in interest of time, but the conclusion that we're trying to come to in terms of policy implications is that it's important to take into account that labor market developments really matters in terms of the conduct of monetary policy in South Africa, given the special features of the economy. So if you ignore the linkages between nominal wage, prices, and unemployment, I'm afraid your specification of the Phillips curve that helps you define the central bank target and keep the inflation around the band, inside the band. If you ignore that strong connectivity, then you are bound to have a Phillips curve that is either biased or flawed, or actually both. So this is what I wanted to talk about today, and thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Vincent, for getting us off to such a great start. Not only a really interesting paper, but absolutely bang on time. So thank you for that. Let me remind participants, any questions that you have in the Q&A, and any for this paper, South African unemployment, or Vincent will indicate that's what you want to talk about. Let me move immediately to Karol. Karol Mazur, who's going to talk to us about agricultural input subsidies in general equilibrium. So again, Karol, you have about 15 minutes and the floor is yours. Thank you.
You all do see my slide, right?
That's fine.
Okay, so this is a joint project with my friend Laszlo Teteni, who is an economist at Bank of Portugal, and I'm here at Trinity College finishing my postdoctoral fellowship. So the project we want to investigate here is focusing on agricultural productivity in developing countries, where, as a broad motivation, we start with this observation that agricultural productivity does seem to be an important driver of economic development patterns. And if we look at the regions of sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, then they had quite different experiences in terms of changes in agricultural productivity, where Asia was benefiting from the so-called Green Revolution, but sub-Saharan Africa not so much. And this has been recognized by policymakers. And in 2003, one response to this to this disappointing performance of African agriculture was the so-called Maputo Declaration, where I think around 10 countries from the region committed efforts to increasing productivity, performance of their local agricultural sectors. This was not specifying what these efforts would precisely look like, but this was more, I think, in terms of spending as a share of GDP and so on. And one of the policies that kind of followed this declaration, or was maybe in some countries was actually implemented before the declaration itself was signed, were the so-called input subsidy programs. And these programs in virtually all countries apart from Ghana, they target staples production because these programs are not only meant to increase the productivity, but also to enhance food security. Food security being, a major issue in these sub-Saharan countries. So there has been, I think, quite a lot of literature on these programs. There are very different views. There's a lot of debate going on about these programs, and some people who are skeptical about the programs may say that this may be diverting resources from other activities, introducing misallocation in the economy. You can think, that maybe subsidizing staples takes resources away from cash crops, and cash crops are in many of these countries the main exportable item. This may have long-run consequences in terms of structural change. Political economy also applies here, right? Implementation, corruption are the issues, of course. And on the other hand, this is a heavily redistributive program. It may improve food security kind of already at the production stage and allow people to avoid high transaction costs in these economies. And also it may also alleviate the credit constraints of farmers. So there are these opposing effects potentially at play, and we want to study these in a macro perspective, both empirically and structurally in general equilibrium. So we are going to, for the data part, we are using two data sources. First, we try to provide some cross-country evidence using data from Food and Agriculture Organization. And what we do here is this is, I call it a macro diff and diff. We split the 46 sub-Saharan countries that we have there into control and treatment group based on the fact whether the country has signed the Maputo Declaration in 2003. So this is our control and treatment comparison here that we have in mind. This is definitely, for many reasons, this is not going to be really clean in terms of the diff and diff methodology, but these countries that implemented input subsidy programs are the ones who actually signed the Maputo Declaration, and we don't see any other countries starting the input subsidy programs in recent years as well. So kind of this set of the treatment group seems to be, at least in this sense, coherent. And then we will try to do some more data work using the data set from Malawi. This will be the LSMS data from 2010. So using the FAO data, we find that there is evidence of increasing yields of staples, but not of cash crops. So what we show here are the yields in non-ISP countries that haven't adopted ISPs or not signed the Maputo Declaration, and those that have done so. So this Maputo Declaration was signed in 2003, but as I was saying, these programs were being implemented in the region around 2003, so maybe starting end of 90s up until late 2000s, depending on the country. And what you see here is that comparing these two groups, we see the evidence that that yields of staples have responded. So this is, probably a first stage what you should expect, if this program is not completely misimplemented, right? Because this program was targeting staples, we don't see any effects here over the productivity of cash crops. Then we look at the other variables. We find that comparing looking at relative price of cash crops versus staples, we see that this relative price in countries with input subsidy programs started to diverge around 2000s. So here, this gap was opening up and becoming wider. So it suggests that the ISPs might have increased the relative price of these cash crops to staples. We also see that the land devoted to staples, as opposed to devoting it to cash crops, has been declining over time. So there is some evidence that ISPs might have closed this gap. So people were devoting more land to staples, and this can be a response to monetary incentives due to the price channel. And then also that these programs this is a shorter time series. Unfortunately, there was no more data available, but we see that countries with input subsidy programs managed to drive down the stunting among children over time. So this food security channel seems to be potentially operating as well. So we have this evidence that productivity of staples goes up, food security is easier to achieve, prices of crops respond in kind of in a general equilibrium sense, and this may allow people to produce more of cash crops because they can produce more effectively using a smaller amount of land, and also prices kind of support these decisions. So this is our evidence from this cross-country panel. Here in the regression table, and this is the typical diff and diff specification with location, time fixed effects, country time fixed effects, time varying implementation of the programs because of what I described. We see that the programs increase yields by around 300 kilograms per hectare. They don't really do much on cash crop yields. Share of land devoted to staples drops by 9%. Ratio of cash crop to staple prices, relative prices, goes up by 18%, and the share of stunted children drops by 11%. So these are effects from the previous figures in a quantitative sense. They are very large. Now we want to talk a little bit more about Malawi. In Malawi, the transaction costs seem to be very large. Here is a figure from paper 2018, JD, Magalhães, and Santaya Lopes, using the same data sets where they compare distribution of home production value evaluated at price at the gate, farmer prices, and consumption prices, whether if they were to go to a shop and buy the maize, which is the main staple in case of Malawi. And if you compare these means of these distributions, then these imply that farmers only get around 20% of the value of their production. So of the consumption value of their production. So this large gap suggests that the transaction costs are large, and this can be due to bad market integration or due to market power of intermediaries. I think different stories can be put forward here, but we find this evidence of large transaction costs, which might be, something that can distort decision making of farmers. We do run some regressions in the cross-sectional data that we have, and we find, for instance, that being a household receiving farm input subsidy items, being either seeds for maize or fertilizer, we see that these households apply 71 kilos more of fertilizer. They devote less they devote less land to maize. Actually, their value of agricultural output is 8% higher, and they self-consume less of the output. So this is kind of in line with our previous set of results, right? That this behavior in the cross section, without, this is not maybe perfectly identified, but we're trying to be convincing, telling the story from multiple angles here. So these results are consistent with our cross-country evidence. So we want to now capture these forces in our macro model, and we want to work with a setting where we have dynamics, we have stochasticity and general equilibrium. We will have heterogeneous agents and financial frictions. There will be three sectors. The first urban.
You're into your last 4 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Chris. We will have 3 sectors. One, urban. So this will be a sector where there's a representative firm producing manufacturing good and will be employing laborers. And there will be 2 rural sectors where farmers will be producing either staples or cash crops, and all 3 goods will be consumed. And on top of it, cash crop will be also exported, being like the major cash export item in sub-Saharan Africa. The households will be subject to idiosyncratic productivity shocks, one for agricultural production process and one shock for labor production. So this will be, generating uncertainty, and this will be mattering for decision making, of course. Households will be accumulating wealth in using standard risk-free technology. They will be choosing occupation between being farmer or a laborer. They will be choosing how much to produce in agriculture and how much to provide labor in the urban sector. We want to think carefully about food security to give, just to these programs from the kind of like food security angle, and we want to introduce subsistence constraint in our production function, so they will be consuming all staples, cash crops, and manufacturing goods, but there will be this constant minimum consumption requirement introducing non-homototicities in these preferences, and there will be transaction costs. So we'll only have it now on staples, unfortunately, but maybe we'll extend it to cash crops as well. But basically, it's a simple way of modeling it, where 1 unit of staples purchase requires this 1 plus QS units of staples that are transported. And this transaction cost will imply that profit maximization may not always be optimal from the household perspective. They might be interested more in kind of optimizing the revenue jointly with their consumption levels. So this is a kind of, I think, what issue well known in the transaction cost literature. Financial frictions, there will be no borrowing limit on this intertemporal wealth accumulation decision here, but we will allow for borrowing for inputs in agricultural production within the period. So we will have a static within the period production technology, and there will be a working capital constraint. There will be government that can potentially run the ISP or other programs, and general equilibrium forces that will be coming through the market prices of staples, cash crops, labor, and capital. Maybe we drop at some point labor capital, but staples and cash crops are potentially key in our story. So I will show the problem of the cash crop producer only now for the sake of time. This is again a within period technology. So they know the prices, current prices of the cash crop and the staple. They have each sector, cash and staple production, have their kind of constant shift parameters here. There will be these theta productivity shocks being idiosyncratic to households. So this is the stochastic element. They will be.
Sorry, Karol, you're in your last minute, so
okay.
Get to
they will be deciding about the split of land between cash crops and staples, and they will be deciding about investment of fertilizers in intermediate goods in X into 2. They will have to finance it, and they need to, and this will be basically the problem they face. So one interesting result here in this static production problem is that the land optimally allocated to cash crops will be declining in subsidy rate to staples. So if ISP is introduced, partial equilibrium will tell us there should be more land devoted to staples, but the effect will be opposite in terms of relative price of cash crops and staples. So here, if you see that this price goes up, the relative price goes up, they will be pushed. This will be this general equilibrium effect will be pushing for more land devoted to cash crops, and this is, I think, where our model will be having something important to say through these general equilibrium effects, not only through the partial equilibrium. So this is it. We want to evaluate the policy. We want to do some more counterfactuals in the future and calibrate it to the setting of Malawi, but this is all the time work in progress. I'm working actively, so if there are any comments, then I would be more than happy to talk about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karol, and sorry for having to rush you at the end, but thank you very much for that paper. And can I please encourage people to enter their questions? Please don't be shy. There's lots of really good stuff here, and I think there's a lot to discuss once we've heard the presentation. So please do enter your questions. So we're going to move to our third paper, which Bruno Morando is going to present on behalf of himself and colleagues on tariffs, productivity, and resource misallocation. So the floor is yours, Bruno. 15 minutes again. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Can you guys see here? Yeah, my screen? All right, very good. So these are joint work, still work in progress with Michael from UNU Wider, Karol from Trinity College Dublin, and John from University of Copenhagen. I myself and Bruno from University of Maynooth in Ireland. We go back to South Africa here, and rather than looking at labor and workers, this paper revolves around capital. In particular, in this paper, we want to study whether and to which extent import tariffs cause capital misallocation in protected industries. So South Africa, like many other countries, both developed and developing, has a system of tariffs that are meant to a certain extent to protect domestic industries. And we want to study to which extent these might reduce productivity through the channel of an inefficient distribution of input across firms. There's a growing interest in identifying and quantifying the extent of resource misallocation, but one of the main critiques that we moved to these models is that there's not a very strong link with policies. There's a parallel literature that looks at tariffs and sort of points towards this direction, showing that tariffs have an heterogeneous impact across firms and might end up being more beneficial to less productive ones than to more productive ones. And we sort of want to try and put these two literature together by actually looking at the impact of these tariffs through a formal model of factor misallocation. And in this case, again, we're talking about capital. You might be aware of some papers about resource misallocation and productivity, perhaps the most famous one being Shi and Clino, Econometrica 2009. The literature has evolved since, and in particular, many new models have been proposed. And in particular, the one that we're going to be using in this paper is the one by David and Venkateswaran, American Economic Review 2019, that provides an unifying framework that allows to tease out different sources of factor misallocation, and in particular, it allows to tease out efficient economic-wide factors to farm-specific distortions. The third literature we're contributing to is this set of anecdotal findings that suggest that imposing tariffs can have a differential impact across the distribution of productivity on your domestic firms. So in this paper, we use administrative data from South Africa, and we only focus on manufacturing firms to estimate the magnitude and identify the sources of capital misallocation using David and the Venkateswaran model. And then we will move on to a reduced form correlation analysis that links the magnitude of these various sources of misallocation with the level of protections in the level of tariffs at the industry level. So we won't be looking at the impact on firm-specific productivity, but rather at the impact of these tariffs on the aggregate productivity through the channel of inefficient distribution of input. This, again, a bit of a warning, is going to be, at the end of the day, a mostly descriptive analysis. So this will be the first work that studies the link between tariffs and misallocation explicitly through a formal misallocation model. Is the first paper that actually looks at the link between tariffs and aggregate productivity losses through this channel. And we're the first one that provides these figures for South Africa. And also, I think, quite interestingly, we're the first ones using administrative data to estimate factor misallocation. So we'll see that our estimates are somewhat a bit off with compared to the ones that come from more traditional surveys. And the extent to which this reflects actual misallocation in South Africa versus the differences in the data is, is still an open question. So any comment on that will be super appreciated. So the seminal model you might be aware of is Shi and Clino, and what they do is basically to compute the dispersion in marginal productivities across firms. And the idea is that if we have no misallocation whatsoever, these marginal productivities should be the same across firms. When we observe that these instead differ from one firm to another, they interpret it as an evidence that some firms are operating on too big a scale and some firms on too small a scale. And they immediately attribute these deviations to misallocation. So there is a one-to-one correspondence between these wedges in marginal productivities and sources of misallocation. There were many critiques of this approach that was again seminal, so still a great paper. But one of that was that, of course, there are a bunch of other reasons why this cross-sectional dispersion in marginal productivities might be observed, not necessarily misallocation. And the model we're going to be using is an extension to this original framework that incorporates some efficient forces behind this dispersion in marginal productivities. And firstly, adjustment costs and uncertainty. So the fact that firms might face cost when changing their level of capital, or the fact that they might experience some unexpected shocks that sort of brings them on a different part of the productivity distribution. On top of that, this model also allows to disentangle 3 different types of distortions that I'm going to be talking in a minute. What we need to estimate this model is a richer set of empirical moments. So as opposed to only dispersion in marginal productivity, you'll need a bunch of other empirical moments that describe the relationship between productivity shocks and investment, the dispersion in investment, and so on. So in a pinch, what you need is firm level panel data to estimate those models. There will be 5 different sources of misallocation that added up all together will constitute the dispersion in marginal productivity. 2 of them are called efficient sources because they're sort of economic wide as opposed to firm specific, and they are the adjustment costs that firms face when changing their level of capital and uncertainty in the form of unanticipated shocks. And these will capture both the variation in these shocks and the extent to which firms can predict that. And then there will be different types of distortions. Some are related to the productivity of the firm itself, and we call them gamma. Some of them are fixed, so they're firm specific and they don't change over time, and they're not related to firm's productivity. And the remainder category is just like a residual sort of umbrella that captures everything else that is not explained by the model. So crucially, we won't only be looking at the dispersion in marginal productivity, but at these 5 different components that altogether adapt to that. These 5 parameters that govern the different shares of misallocation, the shares of the different sources of misallocation, can be expressed as a complex and non-linear function of these 5 empirical moments. And we can estimate that by using numerical methods, general method of moments. And we can then use these parameters to estimate the share of misallocation or observed dispersion in capital productivity that we can attribute to each of these sources. So in a way, this is just a generalization of the Ishii and Clino model that rather than only matching one-to-one these wedges in productivity dispersion to distortions allow to compute a more complex scenario. 5 empirical moments of interest are the dispersion in marginal productivity. So that's the original one that Ishii and Clino looked at. The correlation between firms' productivity and marginal productivity of capital, where this is high, it means that the firms that are more productive are operating in a smaller than efficient scale. We're going to look at other moments that instead describe the correlation of investment and past productivity shock, autocorrelation of investment, and the dispersion of investment themselves. So just to give you a rough idea what the estimation procedure looks like, by matching the empirical moments, we can estimate some parameters. So we'll try to input different values of parameters until you reach something that is very similar to the empirical moments that are observed in the data. Just to give you an idea, here we have 2 iso moment curves that describe the value for volatility and correlated distortions that are consistent with a given level of correlation between productivity and marginal productivity. So this is consistent with a point where correlated distortions are very high. So on the left-hand side here, high in magnitude. and volatility is relatively low, or with a context on the right side of the figure here, where correlated distortions are quite low and volatility is, as opposed, quite high. The impact of these two instead is the same on the autocorrelation between investment and past productivity shock. So a given level is consistent with high level of volatility and high level of correlated distortions, or on the other side with low level of correlated distortions and low level of volatility. So matching all of these moments allows to tease out our parameters of interest. The empirical analysis where we derive these empirical moments is based on administrative data, tax certificates from South African manufacturing firms.
This is your last 4 minutes, Bruno. So
thank you. We do use them to estimate our 5 empirical moments, and then we will divide them in 23 sectors that differ in the level of protections they receive from tariffs. So what we do, we estimate the model on the industry level. So for each industry, we have the 5 components of misallocation, and we regress these on the level of protections guaranteed by tariffs. So the aggregate findings look like this. This is the level of misallocation observed in South Africa, and compared to other countries where they did use the same model to compute misallocation, we can see that is rather high and is mostly driven by distortions as opposed to by efficient sectors. And we do a bit of data analysis to estimate tariffs. It's not as straightforward as we would like to, but eventually we managed to, for each of these 71 industries, to estimate the level of tariffs protection. And what we're going to do is to regress. We have on the left-hand side the magnitude of misallocation driven by a source, and on the right-hand side we have the total level of tariffs. So this will allow us to find some correlation between tariffs and different types of sources of misallocation. So first of all, we do find that when looking at the dispersion in marginal productivity, this is higher in industries with higher level of protection, suggesting that there might be something going on there. Secondly, we really want to look at how each of these components is affected by tariffs. And in particular, we don't expect any impact of the tariffs on adjustment costs, because we argue this is more of a technical feature that depends from the technicalities of the industry. And indeed, we do find that there's no impact whatsoever of tariffs on this technical parameter. When we look at uncertainty, we do find that tariffs reduce the level of uncertainty, because again, by shielding the firms from international competition, probably prices are more stable, and the productivity shocks that include both actual real productivity shocks and prices are less strong in these settings. And interestingly, we do find that there is a strong correlation between tariffs and correlated distortions. Again, this sort of shows that indeed they seem to be way more beneficial to firms in the lower end of the productivity distribution as opposed to one on the higher end. We don't find any particular impact on the fixed distortion. We do find some significance when we introduce sector fixed effects, but in magnitude, we will see this is not particularly high. In order to sort of interpret these numbers, we can exploit the model that allows us to estimate the impact of a change in dispersion into the change in total factual productivity. And what we're going to do is to estimate what would be the impact on those 5 different sources of moving an industry from the bottom quartile in protection to the top quartile in protection. And what we see is that although, as we've seen, there is a reduction in uncertainty, that again implies that there will be a lower dispersion in marginal productivity. This is dwarfed by the negative impact in terms of increase, especially in correlated distortions. So what do we find in our favorite specification is that moving an industry from the bottom quartile to the top quartile in productions through tariffs, and this is about 8% increase in ad valorem tariffs, reduces the aggregate productivity by a sound 10%. So rather sizable losses. So just to conclude, because I think we're nearly done with time, we do find that according to our data and using administrative data, we do find that misallocation seems to be quite pronounced in South Africa. And this is mostly driven by distortions rather than the so-called efficient factors. And we do find that correlated distortions and the industry level tariffs seem to be highly correlated, suggesting again the less productive firms are indeed disproportionately advantaged by protection policies. So if we were to quantify that, an 8% increase in ad valorem import tariffs result in about 11% reduction in productivity of the industry involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruno. That was excellent.
Thanks.
Let's move straight on to our final paper, Marco, talking about FDI, roads, and markups, the case of Ethiopia. So,
okay, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay,
yes.
Excellent. So, yeah. So, thank you very much for inviting me to present this paper. I apologize because my voice is quite low. I started teaching and this is affecting pretty bad my health. So this is a joint paper with Jose Asturias and Asha Sundaram. This is a very, I mean, there's much to say. It will be, I will try to summarize the key things in 3 slots of 5 minutes. Let me start with what has driven us to think about this idea. So we were aware about, because we have been working on this before, the literature, sorry, on FDI, which is really rich and has been investigated a lot about the impact of FDI in terms of linkages and spillovers, including the effect of FDI through competition. This effect has been investigated on several outcomes, but we found surprisingly that there is very little about, if nothing actually so far, about how competition affects pricing strategies of domestic firms in terms of their market power, so basically markups. Okay, and there is evidence summarized in this slide that is quite the competition effect, and how this affects potentially also pricing strategies of firms is an important matter for the country that we are going to use in this paper. So basically, we thought that would be very interesting to understand how policies that actually attract FDI have an implication on welfare through markups. No? So this is what we do in this paper. So we use basically a model, we combine a quantitative model with a reduced form analysis in which we try to assess the implication of a policy that has pushed a lot, like in the context that we analyze, for the entry of foreign firms. We do this in Ethiopia for different reasons. The first one is that it's an interesting case for those who study industrial policies and those who study FDI, because the country has been quite active in attracting foreign firms. A caveat here, our analysis covers the period 1996-2016, which is a period that does not include yet the special economic zones, the industrial parks, which comes to be active a little bit just 1-2 years later from our end-line periods. The second point is that we have also the chance to add geography into the model, because Ethiopia, roughly in the same time span, has invested quite massively in road construction. The road sector development program from 1997 to today is rebuilding the Ethiopian road infrastructure, and this actually matters in the way FDI can actually affect markups through competition. I will not deal about the specificity of the model. We borrow basically from Atkinson Bernstein, in which we model basically Ethiopia like a country in which there are 9 regions that trade with each other. In these regions, labor is the only factor of production. It's not mobile across regions. And firms produce differentiated goods, and they compete a la Cournot. So it's oligopolistic competition. How this model is shaped by our variable of interest is shaped by the entry of foreign firms that affect the playing field, no? Entering and competing directly and indirectly with domestic firms, okay? And so it affects basically their pricing strategy and allocative efficiency in the country. So we use a huge range of microdata to calibrate the model to Ethiopia in 2016, and then we evaluate the role that FDI played for welfare by removing the weight, the importance of FDI under different parameters in our model, bringing them to zero, which was roughly what we observed at the beginning of the period, so 1996. We then decompose Ethiopian welfare in 4 components, 4 channels. The first one, the most important, is the change. So our assessment of welfare is made by what happens to gross national product, real gross national products. But then we also decompose gross national products according to these channels that I will explain to you when we will see the numbers for reasons of time. Then we replicate basically the same exercise by removing all the improvements that were made to the road sector from 1996, so pre-sample, because the road sector development program started in 1997 to 2016, okay? Then we go to the data. We use data that are way more granular, so we use a setting which is more rich in terms of geography and sectoral distribution of firms, and match basically the result of the model with the results of the data. We find that basically the data coming from the model and the real data speaks to each other pretty well. Also in terms of causal relations. So we are also able to give some assessment in terms of causation. So this is a snapshot of our results, because I'm pretty sure I will not be able to present everything. So we find that FDI contributes to relatively important gains for real income in Ethiopian, which we can assess in the order, quantify in the order of almost 10% in terms of GNP. This refers to the manufacturing sector only. So this is a caveat, because the manufacturing sector is still relatively small in terms of overall GDP in the country. So today it counts around 12, 13%. 10 years ago, it was even almost half of this, okay? But then it's important to understand why we decompose this welfare, because we find that part of the real gains risk to be shifted away from Ethiopia. So they contribute to GDP, but not to GNP. And we can quantify this in about 1/3 of the total. Then the second point, I think the most important result to us so far, is that foreign firms do contribute to welfare positively overall, but they have also a small impact, negative impact through worsening allocative efficiency. No, so I will come back on this. We then find that there is an effect which is similar but much less relevant if we only do the same, repeat the same exercise using roads instead of FDI. And then we combine the two measures together. And when we evaluate their joint impact, we find some complementarity, especially in the sense that the roads are able to play down the negative impact of FDI on allocative efficiency. Then we go to the data, and basically, as I mentioned, we find we complement these results with identification strategies based on heterogeneous timing treatment, difference approach, which takes into account this novel literature on negative weightings, etc., and instrumental variable approach that also take care of the potential endogeneity of roads together than FDI. Just a snapshot again on the data. We use large census data for the manufacturing sector, covering 20 years of firm information. This information on firms covers standard variables and also includes data on ownership that allow us to identify from within the data which of them are foreign owned, and which is important for our model, the share of capital of each firm that is owned by foreign persons, foreign entities. The last line is important because we notice, and this is why I just mentioned before that we are not really looking into this new wave of FDI in Ethiopia, because the previous wave of FDI in Ethiopia, the one we analyzed, was and is actually pretty much domestic oriented. Okay. And then we have this very rich road data. We have shape files of the whole Ethiopian road network at the point, geolocalized, for which we can track improvements on a yearly basis. Okay, so we can then construct, I will not show you this, but we can then construct measures of market access that we combine with the FDI data that allow us to really put geography at the center also of our identification strategy in our analysis. So we have pretty net data on the quality of each road segment, and we use the Ethiopian Road Authority average speed assessment in order to evaluate travel time across each pair of locations within a country. So this is to give you a sense of how much roads have improved in Ethiopia. This is basically the road system in 1996, and this is the road system in 2016. This just give you a visual sense of this improvement. I mean, there is much more in the paper if you're interested in this. I will skip the model because we don't really have time, and I will just give you a sense of the quantitative exercise and the model data comparison, which is, I think, quite relevant. So, as I mentioned, we calibrate the model to match the characteristics of the Ethiopian manufacturing sector and the transport cost in place in Ethiopia in each given year, and we do this for 2016. And then we remove first FDI, second roads, and then we remove both roads and FDI from the model. We then, I mean, this is actually what I mentioned to you. So I hope, okay, there is no, I mean, of course, we do this combination of FDI and roads because we have a feeling that the two measures can complement one each other, and they are in fact listed in industrial policy strategy of the country as two of the flagship kind of policies that the country has adopted to increase the competitiveness of the manufacturing sector. So let me go through these broad findings. So basically, these are the 9 regions that we consider, and these are the gains in terms sorry, of welfare that we measure either through changes in GDP per capita and changes in GNP per capita, sorry, not per capita, in real GDP and in real GNP, okay? So the gains that we evaluate as changes in welfare are the latter. So we evaluate a 10% increase in real income in Ethiopia. We also evaluate that about 1/3 of the potential gain are profits that accrue to foreign nationals and so do not contribute to factors to Ethiopian inputs, basically. So we then decompose the changes in GNP, in real GNP, in these three, the first 3 in particular. So the first component is what we call the Ricardian terms, the Ricardian gains, which is basically how much FDI push firms to sell at their marginal cost. The second, the markups terms of trade, is the relation between, for each region, the average markup at which they sell products divided by the average markup at which they buy products. So basically, the higher this relation, the more welfare a region gains compared to other. And then we have the allocative efficiency, which is basically the dispersion in the distribution of markups within a region, okay? The last was basically the share between GNP and GDP. We talked about this later. So what we notice once we decompose...
Marco, you've got about a minute to go.
One?
Well, I'll give you two.
Okay, yeah, okay. So I will just give you this and another, okay? So basically, so this is the gains that we saw before. So most of the gains are explained by the Ricardian term, which is like firms pushed to sell at their marginal cost. But these overestimate the gains because it does not account for the allocative efficiency and the flights of profits out of domestic factors of production. The very last thing is that, I mean, I just leave with this slide so we can finish. I mean, these slides compare data coming from the model with data, with the real data, okay? So reaggregated at region industry or district industry, which is our preferred specification because the district is the third administrative level in Ethiopia. And so we have much more granular information once we move at that level. Also including, I mean, we can also use more data on the road sector actually. I mean, this does not use information on the road. I have another slide, but I will not show you. But we measure basically for each market, which is a combination of a location and a sector, the dispersion of markups, the tail index, and the average markup. So we will see that it's consistent both in the model and in the data that the entry of an FTI, which is big enough to be relevant. So it's a definition of an FT is a diff in diff model, a definition of an FTI that accounts for at least 10% of the market own production affects basically the distribution, so worsen the distribution of markups in terms of increasing the tail and reduce the level of the markup itself. So improve welfare by reducing markups, so firm really produce closer to the marginal, sell to closer to the marginal cost, but worsen the distribution. So show some evidence of misallocation, just linked to the previous paper. I would stop here, but I have something else in the slide. So if something happens during the discussion, I can just show. Thank you. Sorry for
no problem at all. And thank you very much.
Yep.
Very good. So we've had 4 excellent papers, some very strong overlaps between certain pairs of the papers. I've noticed that I have a very shy audience here in terms of questions, but I've got a huge delight to invite our first questioner, Clark Leith, who wanted to ask a question of Bruno, which is to do with the tariffs and misallocation in South Africa. So can Clark be unmuted and offer his question? Welcome, Clark. Please go ahead. Nobody can hear you at the moment. Lucas, is Clark unmuted?
Yes, Clark is unmuted. You should be able to speak right now. You are unmuted.
It's showing mute again.
And now you're unmuted again. Yeah.
Okay, maybe let me present the question on Clark's behalf, and it's a question to do with the relationship between South Africa and the the SACU countries, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and Swaziland. And he asks of Bruno, to what extent, or given the extent of the misallocation that you're finding in South African tariffs, does this not provide evidence of the additional cost of membership of SACU for the other countries of the region?
Well, that's a good question. I think it all depends on what your counterfactual would be like. In a way, like when you negotiate to enter a custom union, like one of the WTO rules is that the average tariffs must be like similar and not higher than the one in the countries that was previously charging the highest level of tariffs. So in a way, I do believe that, you know, belonging to a custom union, although the set of tariffs might in itself be distortionary, like reducing these tariffs within the custom union and the fact that the average overall level of tariffs is probably lower as a result of being in the custom union that would be otherwise, probably sort of suggests that rather than being detrimental, belonging to this custom union is probably, if anything, reducing the level of tariffs, both within the countries belonging to the custom union itself, of course, but also with the rest of the WTO members. So in a way, I wouldn't be I wouldn't necessarily interpret this as evidence in this sense, but I don't know if that answers Clark's questions or if I maybe misunderstood something there.
Let me try just once again, if I can get Clark back on the microphone, if you want to respond on that. Can you try again, Clark? Unfortunately, it seems as if we've got an audio problem here. I can't hear you. I don't think anybody else can. No, unfortunately not. But in the meantime, Marco, you had your hand up. Was this kind of hot pursuit on this point?
Yeah, I wanted to make a question, so I don't know whether I can do it to Bruno. So actually, so while he was responding, I was also thinking to a point that I got while he was talking. So my question was, I was surprised to see, I was curious actually to understand why you focus on imports, and basically, because of course you don't find a causal relation yet, no, so just correlation, but which kind of justification do you have in mind? It's the classical political economy argument in which basically the government knows pretty well that there is some sort of misallocation in resources and wants to protect the weakest part of the productive system, or you have something else in mind? And then a suggestion may be, because of course, I mean, it's difficult to assess causality through tariffs, but I mean, South Africa was quite receiving quite a shock from the entry of China in global world trade. So you might want to test this hypothesis using the typical identification strategy that is used by others in this sense.
Yeah. Excellent. Yes, that was. Yeah. I was going to ask about the political economy of the.
Because it's normally, I mean, it's normally to other dimensions. So for my misallocation, it's really difficult to catch, no, from a policymaker point of view.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Bruno, do you want to respond on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, Marco, for asking this question. Very pertinent indeed. So in a way, first of all, like what we're finding here is that it's not that the tariffs are higher for less productive sectors, but within industries, industries that benefit for a higher level of protections, within those industries, firms in the lower end of the productivity distribution benefit more for tariffs. So we are not claiming in the paper that industries that are less productive receive more tariffs, but that within industries, when tariffs are high, firms that are on the lower end of the distribution benefit more from this sort of policies. Just to give you an idea there, what we find as an example is that when we study the sort of dynamic implication of that, and we look at the probability of exit from production, we see that the firms in the bottom quartile in the productivity distribution in industries that are protected display a lower level probability of exit than the other ones. So the story we're trying to tell is not cross industries, but is within firms in the same industry. In terms, I don't know if that answers your question. Of course, like what you guys point out in terms of the causal identification, that's super hard because of course we do introduce, like, we have several specifications. In some we do introduce some controls because there's a big political economy literature on which industries do actually receive these sort of protections. And there's a huge sort of omitted variable problem there because they tend to be industries where, like, there's a bunch of key big players, so a bunch of very big firms that sort of manage to bargain with the government. And of course, this is also correlated perhaps to misallocation and to distribution of input within different industries. So we do run, again, a bunch of regressions where we add a number of controls, such as share of exporters, concentration of capital and output, and so on. And we do find that our findings are still there, sort of. But in a way, when we add these controls, it's very difficult to assess the extent to which these controls are capturing the leverage that the sector has with the government, and is already in itself capturing the distribution of inputs, so potentially misallocation. So that's one of the I believe the main weaknesses of the paper right now, and this is why I'm quite upfront about it and say this is fairly descriptive and unapologetically so, but that's what it is. In terms of
Bruno, I'd like to make sure we've got time for questions on the other papers as well.
No, apologies. Yeah.
If we do have time, we'll come back. I have one other person on the Q&A, Iman Sharif, but I'm not sure whether you have a question or whether it was just a comment in passing. If you're still online, Iman, perhaps you can unmute yourself. And do you want to, is there a specific question you'd like to ask?
No, I just wanted to thank you all. The presentations have been great. I've been doing work as well. Sorry, I don't want to take your time on the labor market in Sudan. And I will certainly get in touch with Vincent just for more research. And I do appreciate all what you've been presenting. Really great presentations, great models, so inspiring. Thank you so much indeed. It's been an honor being with you. Thank you for giving me the time to speak.
You're welcome, and thank you, Iman, for those very kind words. I'm going to follow them up, abuse the privilege of the chair, and follow up with a question for Vincent, because I think this hysteresis paper is really nice. And two things caught my eye in your presentation. The first, I like the way that you're constructing this this hysteresis index. You motivated the paper at the very beginning by talking about the post-2020 period. But what's striking about your index is it has this enormously rapid increase in the hysteresis index from about 2018. And I wonder, so my first question is, can you explain what's going on there for those of us who don't fully understand the South African economy? And then the second related point is, you're looking at an aggregate unemployment rate. I imagine the kind of dynamics of hysteresis are extremely different if you were able to disaggregate by skill, for example. You talked about a demographic effect, that it's dominant amongst the youth, but if you're in the skilled labor market in South Africa, are you facing this same kind of dominant, overwhelming hysteresis problems that if you lose your job, you remain unemployed for a long time, or are what we're observing really concentrated in the low skill part of the labor market? And so why don't you respond to those? And I know Karol has a question he wants to follow up on.
Okay, thanks for the questions. Those are actually really, really nice questions. I'll try to respond as fast as possible. So first, for the first question, what I would like to emphasize is the fact that we deliberately do not want to include the COVID situation, because when you look at the numbers of unemployment at the moment are quite ridiculous, right? Forgive the term. So what you see in the data is basically what I'm trying to do with the business confidence index, right? Like, because there hasn't been a recession per se, but since 2015, there was a scenario where the economy was confronted with two big issues. One, the price of the commodity price shocks that occurred during that period, like, didn't benefit the country very much, which meant that during that period, there was a sustained decrease into business confidence, right? And the second thing is that there were so many political and social unrest during that period that led the country toward a path of unsustainable growth, right? So all these elements, as a result, basically push the interest rate, the unemployment super high, right? Like, and that's why you see that huge jump toward the end of the sample, right? And I guess that's the point of the paper. The point of the paper, and it's in its title, unless something good happened into the economy, the unemployment rate keeps going on. That's because of a number of reasons, right? One is because there is a huge skill gap between the workers, with an abundance of people who are unskilled, and it contributes to all those factors. And also, South Africa is not really a fast-growing economy. It hasn't been the case for a while. Okay, so that's one thing. For the second question, the simplest way to answer the question is basically in the second part of the paper, where you differentiate between the insiders and the outsiders, right? And basically, the skilled people are in a world of their own. And the argument that people in the papers that keeps coming out is the idea that South Africa is a dual economy, right? Because it's polar opposite. So no, you don't have that hysteresis phenomenon happening for the skilled labor, but like, of course, you have to define what is skilled, right? What is skilled labor? That's also a different thing. However, in the among the low-skilled people, regardless of the negative shocks, you still have that kind of hysteresis response, right? That occurred during the 2008 financial crisis, and I'm pretty sure this is what is happening now. We just don't have enough data to actually prove it at the moment. So to answer your question, that's what I would say, I guess. I'm sorry, I think you're mute.
Yeah, I think those are really interesting responses. Two very quick follow-ups, and then I'll move to Karol. When I looked at you talked about this big rise in unemployment at the end of the period. And then you're using that data or data over that period to extract a kind of a latent measure of persistence. And it almost felt a little bit like the problem you get doing things like Hodrick-Prescott filters. That when you get to the end of the sample, the correlation between the actual data and the filtered component rises very sharply. And I'm not questioning the unemployment rate, but it's the constructed latent index following the actual rate too closely because of this end of sample period. But I think your point about the mapping of insiders and outsiders, just kind of skilled and unskilled, is very interesting. Although, in a sense, if you think that hysteresis is about the loss of skills, then in a sense, the hysteresis problem to a large extent is about the erosion of the human capital that had been acquired. And so there's a kind of a bias towards expecting it amongst those that had accumulated specific skills that then become undervalued or eroded over time. But let's not hog all the time here. I think this is a really interesting paper. Thank you very much for that. Karol, you wanted to make a comment?
Yeah, just to Vincent, so the way you described it, it sounds a little bit like if you had in mind that there are some room for multiple equilibria in the labor market, and that somehow I don't know, some policies or interaction of social, I don't know, unrest and so on, kind of maybe coordinated the economy in this, I don't know, the call it a bad equilibrium. Is it something that you have in mind, that there can be some coordination here? And I don't know if you have like some suspect on the policy, labor market policies that could be kind of like an important driver of this, or this is, I mean, I know it's very complex, but maybe you have thought about it.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point, because that takes me to the next step of this paper. I would like to just say that, like, this paper is basically like a general look of what the data is telling us, right? Like, it's not about modeling or whatever. Anyway, so your point about moving equilibrium and all that, right? Like, so the idea now is just that you need to keep in mind that we have a structural problem of unemployment in South Africa, right? So unless something, it's always going to be the case that if something bad happens, a lot of people are going to lose their jobs because the economy just doesn't grow as fast, okay? So instead of having multiple equilibrium, right, the idea now is just to build some sort of like Markov switching sort of model in which you will have like, two regimes, right? Like, a regime where like, the index itself, it's super high, okay? Those are usually when the shocks hit the economy. And also you'll have a regime where the index is low, okay? So that will solve the problem of having multiple equilibrium into the model, right? But the idea is not that you have multiple equilibrium. The idea is just that like, the equilibrium keeps shifting, right? Depending on what state the economy is at. And the Markov switching regime will be the best way to approach that.
Thank you. No more
Can I
questions.
ask a one-liner to Karol, maybe?
Please do, yes. Yeah.
Karol, great paper, like super interesting. Can I just ask you, maybe you said that, but how do you differentiate staples and cash crops?
So staples are all cereal crops. And so this will be maize, wheat, barley. So, like different countries in the sample will have different weights on these crops, but I mean, cereals are our staples. In Malawi case, this will be clearly maize. And then as cash crops, we take cocoa, coffee, sugarcane, tobacco, cotton, and tea. So kind of the major exportable items from what I understand. So these are this is the definition we take.
So it's not based on sort of share of consumption, typical share of consumption of the households. So if you have like a country where maize is typically sold rather than self-consumed, that's still a staple.
Yeah. That's not how we. It's not how we did it. So I don't know. I mean, if you know a paper that does it like this.
Oh no. That's like that makes complete sense. I was just asking.
Okay.
Yeah. No.
So
no
I think. I mean, like we try to look carefully at the transaction costs, and if you kind of, I think if I think about your approach, then this transaction cost somehow and the trade versus self-consumption kind of gets lost maybe with this approach. I don't know, but I mean that's maybe an alternative thing to do here.
Yeah. No, I was just curious. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, folks. I believe we've got to pull this to a close at 6 o'clock. I'm sorry we didn't have more questions. And indeed more time, because there's 4 really exciting papers here. I think they're really absolutely first rate. There's lots of really good stuff, but you need to get into the weeds of these papers a little bit more. The Gather Town social area is still open. There's the program will explain how to log on, and you can, if you're all logged on, you can find each other and follow up these discussions. But for the moment, let me just thank everyone for participating. My apologies to Clark Leith for not being able to get him on audio. Clark's probably not known as well to most of you as he is to me. He was my very important mentor about 30 years ago when he was a highly influential advisor in Botswana. Hence the questions about SACU and protection. So my apologies to Clark there, but my great thanks and congratulations to all 4 presenters. We have another macro session tomorrow afternoon on some fiscal and monetary policy. I hope some of, if not all of you, will attend that in the audience. So for the moment, Vincent, Marco, Bruno, Karol, thank you very much indeed for your papers, and have a good evening. Thank you.